You're watching FJTN, the Federal Judicial Television Network.
Live from the Judiciary's Teletraining Studio in Washington, D.C., the Federal Judicial Center presents Assessing Training Needs, Designing Surveys That Work.
Hello, and welcome to the FJTN. I'm Bob Luke, Training Specialist with the Federal Judicial Center, and I'm delighted that you were able to join us today. I will be your moderator for our hour-and-a-half program. Our purpose today is to learn how to use surveys to assess training needs in the courts. We'll discuss when it's most appropriate to use a survey, how to write the kinds of questions that will get you the information you're looking for, how to tell the difference between what's a training need and what's not a training need from survey results, and ways to administer surveys that ensure you a high return rate while at the same time making a minimum of bother for people who are going to be filling them out. Your participant guide, which I trust you all have a copy of, contains the information we're going to be talking about and has space for you to take notes as we go. You'll also find toward the end of your participant guide a piece on surveys by Donna Steenstra, who is with the research division of the center. In terms of questions for the broadcast, we'll be taking questions at 2 points in the program. The first point will be right after the discussion about scales, frequency, quantity, Likert, and the like. When you hear that discussion coming, you'll know the question and answer period is not far behind. And you should see a notice on your screen about 5 minutes prior to each question time. You may fax your questions here to the studio using the fax form, just the fax, at any time throughout the program. Once a question occurs to you, just jot it down on the fax form and send it in. Please make your questions as clear and concise as possible. Write legibly, include your name and district, and indicate whether you are a push-to-talk site or a view-only site. We'll get to as many of your questions as time permits. For push-to-talk sites, I'll call on the person by name who submitted the fax and ask that person to ask his or her question to our instructor. For the view-only sites, I'll convey the questions to our instructor. 2 requests for those of you at push-to-talk sites. If while you are talking at the microphone, you hear that screechy, screechy feedback noise, please just turn the volume all the way down on your monitor, and that will take care of the feedback. Secondly, make sure that the toggle switch on your push-to-talk equipment is in the off position. Otherwise, you won't be able to hear the broadcast, and of course, we wouldn't want that. If you experience any video or audio problems with the broadcast, please call GE SpaceNet at the number that's on your screen now. GE SpaceNet will be able to help you with whatever the problem might be, and you might mention to GE that you're with the Federal Judicial Center's broadcast. And now on to the program. To lead us in our discussion, we are very pleased to have Suzanne J. Lulowitz, President of SJL Associates in Washington, D.C. Suzanne has consulted with many clients, including, most recently, the American Red Cross and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, on assessing training needs and designing and administering climate surveys. We are very pleased to have her with us today. Suzanne?
Thank you, Bob, and thank all of you for the opportunity to share information on designing surveys to help you with your training needs assessments. Before we go into the objectives for this program, I'd like to refer you to your participant guide because there are some changes that I need to address so that as we go through the information, you suddenly realize that there may be something different in your guide than from what I'm talking about. So what I'd like to do is direct you to page 3 in your guide. And if you look at the table at the bottom of page 3, you'll see the 80% in the lower right-hand corner of the table. That should be 88%. So if you would make that change. Then if you would turn to page 4, you will see a series of 6 steps for the Planning Needs Assessment checklist. There is some change there, and what you need to include is, as step 4, you should identify confidentiality as one of the steps and allow enough space so that you can take some notes around that step. The 5th step will be collect the assessment data, which is now identified as step 4, and you can remove step 5 and step 6, analyze and confirm the data, and prepare the final report, because while I will be covering that later in the broadcast, it's really not a part of the Planning Needs Assessment checklist, and you should know that at this stage. The final change I'd like to make with your guide is on page 19, and if you would turn there, you'll see at the top of page 19 something identified as a frequency distribution chart. Please change that to read percentage distribution chart, since that was identified mistakenly. So that takes care of issues around the participant guide, so that should help you as you're, if you use it as a guide to what we're talking about today. Let's turn now to the program objectives for what we're going to be doing here in the next hour and a half. First of all, we're going to be using a training needs assessment checklist to plan your survey. A checklist is an important tool for you to use to focus on issues that you need to think about and questions that you need to answer in order to plan your own needs assessment. It ensures that you do not miss important steps. Secondly, you will be able to describe when a survey is the best method. You as a training coordinator have a number of choices regarding methodology. Some of you are familiar with focus groups or interviews, but this broadcast will be devoted solely to the survey. Next, we're going to be designing an effective survey, or talking about how to design an effective survey. And in this area, we'll be focusing on the writing of questions and the physical design of the survey. Next, we'll be looking at the advantages and disadvantages on the use of electronic surveys. I'll be highlighting that very briefly, simply because we operate in an environment of World Wide Web and email technology. So because surveys are such a number crunching area, it's good to at least have some understanding of what electronic surveys can and cannot do for you. Next, we'll be looking at techniques for promoting survey return rates. And while everything that I say here is designed to help you increase the returns on your surveys that you send to staff, there are some specific tips you can keep in mind and consider. Also, and finally, we'll be analyzing survey data and how you can craft your training recommendations. In other words, once you get the wealth of this data returned, what are you going to do with it, and how are you going to design your training solutions and recommend to staff in order to solve any issue or problem that you are identifying with your training solutions. Okay, let's turn to our needs assessment process itself. There are reasons why you would want to use a training needs assessment, and it is a key planning tool that you need to take advantage of. The first reason that it is a key planning tool for you is that you can make decisions about what programs to implement, whether you do that on a quarterly, half-yearly, or yearly basis. Then it's a key planning tool to help you or the decision makers that you work with understand what may be the causes of performance problems. Then I want to identify for you a needs assessment scenario. Many of you have been asked, if not all of you were notified, to read the needs assessment scenario that we included on page 2 of your participant guide. But what I want to do is briefly summarize it, just in case many of you may not have had an opportunity to take a look at it. And this is in sum what it says. Your court unit executive has received, through a variety of ways, a report detailing a growing increase in the number of external customer complaints. And these complaints are occurring as a direct result of staff contact with customers via telephone, and also in person. The report goes on to highlight that the reason for this increase in customer complaints has to do with a lack of skills on the part of staff in the areas of conflict management, knowledge of court unit operations, and interactive listening. While there may be other areas that could be or could potentially impact this problem, the report really identifies that these are the major foundational issues fueling this customer complaint problem. You, as the training coordinator, have now been asked to identify how staff perceive their job performance in the 3 skill areas the report identified. So what you're going to need to do is identify and classify what specific training you feel needs to be implemented that will address this issue of poor customer service. To let you know where you're going to be trying to get to as a result of your needs assessment, you've got before you a classification of training need. And we've taken one of the issues that we've identified in the report, and it's the conflict management area. And what you're trying to do is identify how much of a gap there is between the relevance of conflict management and the identified competence staff feels in that particular area. What you're seeing before you is that 72% of the staff, and this would be after the survey, this would be a summary finding, 72% of the staff have identified conflict management as of high relevancy to the performance of their jobs, while only 12% of staff perceive themselves as being competent in the area of conflict management. What this tells you then is that you've got quite a gap between the relevance and the competence, so that your training recommendation would very likely focus in ensuring that conflict management skills were a key element to overcoming this customer service problem. Okay, now that we've told you where we want to get to, let's now turn to the assessment planning checklist, which we've identified as a key tool for you to use. The first step that you want to take in your assessment planning checklist is, number 1, to define your objectives. And with regard to this particular needs assessment scenario, what we defined was you needed to know what staff's perception was of their competence in the 3 skill areas. So that's going to be the objective of your training needs assessment. However, there's also a planned outcome that gets included with these objectives, and that is the fact that you're going to need to identify what particular training is the recommended solution to overcome the performance problem of customer service. Our second step to the planning checklist is to identify the needed data. What this means is, whom do you need to survey? What job functions, tasks, skills, knowledge, and attitudes are going to be the focus of your survey. In addition to the 3 skill areas that we've identified in the scenario, you're also going to have to break down those 3 skill areas into component behaviors. The reason for that is because individuals may have different perceptions of what conflict management means and what interactive listening may mean. There is specific literature out there that identifies the standard behaviors that qualify as being good conflict management and good interactive listening, so that in order to make sure that you're zeroing in on the competency area for staff, you really do need to make sure that you're identifying component behaviors that allow staff to assess their own competence and give you the information that you need. Then what we want to take a look at is selecting the appropriate data collection method. While our focus today is on surveys, I do want you to be aware that there are other options that you might want to use, such as focus groups and interviews, or possibly multiple ways of collecting data. But our focus today is purely on how to deal with surveys. At this point in your checklist, you're also going to want to consider who will administer the project. Are there enough resources to administer the project? Is there a process in place to manage the project? And most of all, how much will it interrupt everyone's work? The next thing you're going to want to look at is the issue of confidentiality. This is a key area because you need to get response you need to get honest responses from staff who will complete your survey. And confidentiality is in direct relationship to the honesty with which people will respond to the questions that you're asking. There may not always be a need to be confidential about the responses that staff will give you, but you always need to let people know that either it will be treated confidentially, the answers that they give you, or that they won't, so that they know exactly what's going to happen with their information. But again, always bear in mind that the more confidential or the enforcement of a confidentiality policy will very likely lead to more honest responses on the part of your staff. Then our last step that you want to take a look at in the assessment planning checklist is the collection of the data. How are you going to collect it? How are you going to process it? You've got choices as to whether to do it manually or to use computer software. Since surveys are a high number crunching way to deal with data, you really need to take a look at what you're going to do when you manage the administration of the project. Now, even though we're looking solely at surveys in this broadcast, there are some guides that would help you when you're deciding to use a survey that I'd like to cover at this point. The advantages to using a survey are, number one, that it is inexpensive. So that can save you resources at that end, especially when you're comparing it to focus groups and interviews. They help you maintain anonymity. If confidentiality is a key issue for you and for the staff who are responding to the survey, surveys can be very helpful because they maintain the staff's anonymity. Next, there's no special training needed to administer, as there would be with focus groups and interviews, because skilled facilitators and skilled interviewers are needed for both those options. And finally, the advantage is that standard surveys can be available or are available to help you reduce the development skills, time, and costs that may be needed to put your surveys together. Now, I'd like to call your attention to two things. One is that this is a time where you can be a resource to each other. Those of you who are developing surveys, and you may have a range of skills in those areas, should find it a really helpful thing to others to see how you've developed your surveys, share your surveys among yourselves. Where you're going to have unique needs with training needs assessments, this is a good opportunity to get that expertise to permeate all of the different court units so you can tweak, use questions without having to reinvent the wheel. The in-court education branch has also let me know that I need to tell you that they would be happy to take a look at any surveys that you design, so that if you develop a survey and you'd like to get some advice or some expertise to take a look at where changes might be important, that's a good opportunity for you to tap some internal expertise. There are disadvantages to using surveys that you need to know about. One is that they involve one-way communications. You're unable to clear up any kind of ambiguities that may occur, so therefore this is going to be a problem if you've not clearly defined what it is that you're asking from the people who are participating in the project. Secondly, it requires technical skills to develop. This can be a problem for you because if you do not have the technical skills to develop, then, as our next point says, it can be poorly designed and as a result may miss the point of what you're trying to assess, and all of the time that you've put into the project can be wasted. And finally, it produces low return rates. This is the bane of all surveys, and I will cover some tips and techniques to take a look at how you might be able to handle dealing with low return rates, but always keep in mind that everything I'm talking about here is designed to help you increase the number of returns that you get on your surveys. Let me cover very briefly electronic surveys, and again there are ups and downs to those as well. First of all, let's take a look at the advantages. They can be completed online, so the turnaround of responses can be very quick, and also it reduces and eliminates the need for data entry. Because surveys, again, can be very number crunching, this can be a real boon for you if you're having to do a lot of surveys and your population is really comfortable using the computer. Then let's take a look at the disadvantages. Number one, it can be costly, and that would involve researching what type of survey program, since there's so many out there, that you really want to use. The actual purchase, the installation, training, and any kind of technical support. Also, there can be response bias built into the use of electronic surveys because there are many people who still may be uncomfortable with using a computer or who may be traveling and may find it hard to take advantage of using a computer. You may be selecting out people who could be a part of your survey, and they may be along that line of just access to a computer or feeling uncomfortable around a computer, that will build in a bias to the information that you do receive as a result of the data of completed surveys. Okay, let's now turn to designing effective surveys. And what I'd like to take a look at, and many of you ask questions around these issues, and that is the issue of open versus closed questions. First of all, when you're looking at open questions, you're looking at staff using their own words to respond to your questions. When you're looking at closed questions, you are giving them pre-selected response choices that they have to respond to your question. To give you an example of an open question, and we'll do some comparison here so you can see some of the differences. This is an example that I've taken from actually one of your needs assessments, and that is, what do you feel are your most immediate computer training needs? And we've allowed space for people to put in their own information. As we look at the advantages to open questions, what we see is that they can be useful in eliciting a range of responses and allow respondents to provide in-depth information. This can be very useful when you know that staff really don't have much information, nor do you, in terms of knowing specifically what range of responses to focus in on. Some of the disadvantages, though, to open-ended questions is that they are costly in terms of time and energy, not only in terms of time and energy for the staff who are answering the survey, but for you as well, when you have to take the information and compile it and analyze it. Also, the subject is, the interpretation of the is subject to bias. And what this means is that participants of the project may put in information that may be strongly affecting them the day that they are responding to your survey, but not necessarily providing a balanced perspective on what their training needs may be. Also, you are going to be given a wealth of information, and what you pull out of that may reflect your own biases in terms of what you think is important and not necessarily the staff who are completing the survey. Also, as I highlighted earlier, they're challenging to analyze and interpret. You've got a lot of information, and to exclude that bias that you and the staff may be bringing to it requires a great deal of energy and effort and skill on your part. However, what we're going to be trying to do is to identify some of the challenges involved in analysis and interpretation. Let's turn to the example of a closed question. In which of the following computer skill areas do you need training in order to perform your job? And we're asking staff to check all those that apply. What we've done is taken the same information that we've asked in the open question and put it in a closed question environment. This allows the individual a list of things that they can check off, so they really don't have to think through, now, well, what do I need now? What will I need tomorrow? What will I need next week? And to help close some gaps that I thought might be there as a result of missing out on a particular software, and we'll go into that a little bit more on the response scales, I've included a choice of other, so that allows the participant in the project to at least put in something that I may not have identified, and that may take care of some frustration if they do have a response. I've pre-selected choices for them and haven't given them an option to something that may not be listed there when that is something they need to identify. But again, I will go into other because care must be taken when you do include that option as one of your response choices. But in terms of closed questions, let's take a look at the advantages to using them. One, they're easier for staff to answer. They're also easier for you to analyze because you can do more numerical compiling of information rather than content analysis. It also shortens the response time. It's so much easier to move through a survey when you've got pre-selected choices than when a staff person has to come up with their own wording in response to the issue. It's also easier to comment on sensitive subjects when closed questions are being used because it can be difficult and painful for people to come up with their own wording, whereas pre-selected choices can help them narrow their focus and make it easier for them to respond to your question. Some of the disadvantages to closed questions, in fact the only disadvantage really to closed questions other than having the skill to write them, is the fact that they are challenging. And that is one of the things that we're going to try to help you get through during the remainder of this broadcast. There are plenty of things that you need to consider for closed questions, and while they can be easier for staff to use and while they can shorten the response time, help increase your return rates, it's you who's going to bear the burden of having to write them. And so hopefully what you learn from this broadcast will enable you to do that. And to carry through on that thought, let's take a look at how you write effective questions. First of all, you want to make sure that your questions are short, simple, and direct. You also want to make sure that your questions are clear and specific. I've put a wrong and a right example on your screen. You can see just by the wordiness of the wrong example that it takes a lot of thought to try to figure out what it is the person is asking. So the shortest, simplest, most direct way of asking your question is really the best. However, if you look at customer focused, and when we go to the next element of writing effective questions, and that is to ensure that all staff understand the language, customer-focused may be one of those what we could call jargony phrases, so you may want to take a look at a closer look at the language that you use when you start to shorten up your questions to ensure that you're using language all of your staff will understand. Then you also want to stay away from the double-barreled question. An example of a double-barreled question is, have you attended any customer service training, and if so, when? A question should never ask more than one question. Part of the problem is that you don't know which question the participant in the project has answered, nor may they necessarily know which one you want them to answer. So always ensure that your questions are asking only one question. Then you also want to ensure that your questions are not loaded. And here's an example of a loaded question. Do you support conflict management training as a way for people to be more respectful of others? This is one of those how often do you beat your spouse types of questions. There's very few people, there are very few people who would not support conflict management training because we all recognize that being more respectful of others is an important value. So because of that, you're literally directing people towards one particular answer, and this is the reason as to why it's considered loaded. And finally, you want to ensure that the questions apply to all the staff so that there are specific managers or line staff or administrative staff that certain questions would not apply to. Then you're looking at maybe a different kind of survey. But always make sure that when people are getting a survey that all of the questions are applying to them. Otherwise it can be very complicated. People may not answer a question or they may answer a question that doesn't apply to them, and so you're getting false data. They may not answer a question that doesn't apply to them. You don't know whether they've missed it through accident or they've omitted it for some reason. So otherwise, because it's so confusing, always make sure that your questions apply to everybody. There are two other areas I'd like to identify in terms of writing effective questions, and that is the use of transitions. You have before you an example of a transitional note, and it reads, "This survey so far has been asking you about general customer service issues. Now it will focus on asking questions about job skills in order to more clearly identify training needs that may help improve performance." These types of transitional notes identify for the people who are completing this survey that there's a shift now in the focus of the questions. anything that's useful in guiding them through the survey, especially when your intent suddenly shifts in terms of the outcomes of these questions, is going to be helpful for them when they're completing it. And that leads me to my next point, which is the pre-testing of all questions. I cover the pre-testing of the whole survey project a little bit later in the broadcast, so I'll get into that in detail. But you really do need to make sure that in order to touch on everything we've identified, that all your questions do get pre-tested. A second component of effective questions is the response scales that you choose. Because we're dealing with closed questions here, response scales are going to be extremely important. And there are 5 that we're covering during this broadcast: the checklist scale, the quantity scale, the Likert scale, frequency scales, and ranking questions. First, let's focus on the checklist scale. And let me read you the question that you have before you. I interact with other agency personnel in the following ways. And the fact that you're asking staff to check all that apply is what makes this a checklist question. So they're not choosing one answer over anything else. It's just everything that will apply. This is a cafeteria type of menu that gives them possible choices. One of the things I'd like to draw to your attention is the numbers at the left-hand side of the response choices. Always make sure that you give a numerical value to your response choices, because as we start to do the summary findings, you'll see we do something with those numbers, but also it helps you when you're compiling your data that as you're identifying these response choices, that there is a number that can be crunched into your data findings. So in addition to numbering your questions, which I'll go in the physical layout, you also need to be numbering your response choices. The other option that I've given here also again covers a gap where there's the possibility there is some unknown way that people are interacting with customers, so I've given them an option to fill that in. Otherwise, you know, there might be something missed here. And I've chosen the other because I think I know that a lot of people would be choosing some of the other choices, and I just want to catch maybe some other things that might be cropping up. But you have to be real careful there so that you don't get a lot of your staff or a majority of your staff checking other, putting in something that is different across the board, and you are dealing with a closed question and having to analyze it almost like an open question. In interpreting a checklist, this is how you would take the information that you get in compiling the data. What we've done here is identify the fact that of the 32 staff we are surveying, 7 have no interaction at all. So the remaining 25 are interacting by telephone. But of those 25, they're spread out also in interacting by email, interacting with people in person, and also interacting by mail. Next to the telephone, the most common interaction is with face-to-face or in person. And that lines up with what's the problem in our needs assessment scenario, which is all of the complaints are coming through the telephone and the interpersonal interaction. When would you want to use a checklist scale in your survey? The most common reasons are to learn what events, activities, or experiences may or may not apply to staff. And secondly, when you wanted to be economical, and that's a key for keeping surveys short. One question can provide you with a lot of information. However, as I called attention to in the identification of the other choice, you really must know that when you set up your response scale, that 90% of the answers chosen by staff fall in those response ranges other than that other. Again, because if you get into people not being able to identify the choice, they'll either not answer the question or they'll check other and put in a series of different answers. And once again, you're dealing with a wealth of information that you tried not to have to deal with through the use of the closed question. Our next scale is the quantity scale. And an example of that is before you, for what proportion of your customer service activities do you receive clear and specific instructions from your supervisor? And this is basically one of those how much questions. You can either ask it in percentages or numbers. For this particular question, to keep in line with our scenario, it's proportion. And the purpose of this question is relating to the knowledge of court unit operations. And what we are asking our participants in the project to do is to let us know how much of their activities is subject to instruction from their supervisor. And the rating scale we've given them is almost all to almost none. How would you interpret the data that you receive from a quantity scale? Our focus is on number and percentage distributions. In this example, what it tells us is that 75% of staff have instruction over more than half of their customer service related activities. Depending on what you get out in the additional findings of your survey, the data here would appear to support no need for training in understanding court unit operations, since you're getting plenty of instruction from supervisors as to dealing with customer service related issues. When would you want to use a quantity scale? This would go into play when you wanted to learn how staff quantifies an experience, an event, or an activity. And again, you would need to know that 90% of the pre-selected choices that you're giving staff would fall in, they would be able to identify. Next, I'd like to look at the Likert scale. And what distinguishes this scale, as you may see from the example, is that we're not dealing with a question here. We're actually dealing with a statement. And what we're asking staff to do is to identify the intensity with which they disagree or agree with this statement. What's really nice about the Likert scale is you can use this one scale and ask a whole series of statements of the participants in your project and see whether they agree or disagree, so that you can obtain multiple staff views on a variety of issues. How would you interpret a Likert scale? Again, our focus is on percentages and distribution. What we've done is identify all of the data we've compiled from our survey, and this example tells us that the staff range across a continuum, with our largest group being at disagree. That's 34%, or 11 of the staff, and we're looking at 32 is the number of staff for this particular survey. However, you can also make a summary statement that says 50% of the staff, or 16 people, disagree, to strongly disagree, that customer satisfaction is even a top priority with the court unit. So that suddenly will raise a red flag for you that where it stands in a level of priorities may be a part of this potential, of this customer service issue. When would you want to use a Likert scale? When you wanted to measure the intensity of agreement or disagreement on a certain issue or conclusion. Also, like the checklist, it can be very economical because you can use the one scale for several items. However, you must know that the majority of the staff will not choose the neutral value. If you look at the example of the Likert scale in your guide, which was the same that we had on the earlier visual, you see that the neutral or middle value is identified as a mildly agree. In some other Likert scales, you'll see it identified as neutral, and I've put mildly agree there to give it a more positive aspect. But if you find that staff are choosing that mildly agree or neutral value predominantly, then you may end up getting a lot of information that doesn't really tell you very much, because what's happening is people don't feel strongly one way or the other, and that may tell you something completely different, but it may not get at what it is you specifically want to know. So you really do want to get people who are in strong agreement or strong disagreement, or just disagreement, rather than that focus on that middle value. Let's take a look at the frequency scale. And this is very similar to the quantity scale, except that instead of asking how much, what we're asking here is how often. And this question reads, on most days, how often do you find yourself dealing with customers you consider difficult? And the scale that we use here ranges from never to always, with rarely, sometimes, and often being the categories in between. To interpret a frequency scale, you again focus on the percentages and the number distributions. What this summary tells us is that 24% of the staff often deal with difficult customers. So that's literally 1/4 of your staff consider dealing with difficult customers to be a common occurrence. However, what you also find out is that the remaining staff, which is 76%, sometimes to never deal with difficult customers. So this will begin to focus on just who is going to be the audience for the training that you're going to plan on recommending be implemented. When would you want to use a frequency scale? When you wanted to measure how often something is occurring, whether that something is a feeling or an event. However, you do need to recognize that when you use this scale, there's a problem with precision, because frequency measures from never to always. If you want to get at something more precise, like how much proportional or percentages or numbers something may be occurring, then you would want to use the quantity scale. My last scale that I want to look at is the ranking question. And the example that you see before you is it asks a staff to say, rank the skills listed below in order of importance to your job. And I've shortened it to read, place a 1 next to the skill you perceive as most important, and so forth. You wouldn't ask the question quite that way. You would give them a little bit more direction by saying, place a 1 next to the skill you perceive as most important, a 2 and 3, so that they know that they're ranking and prioritizing, not just placing a 1. But I did this because of space on the visual. But that's what a ranking question is asking, is for people to prioritize a series of items that you've listed in your scale. To interpret a ranking question, this graph highlights a nice way to do it, and we've identified here, rather than numbers, because you can do both numbers and percentages. I mean, rather than percentages, I've chosen numbers, and you can do either. But what we've identified is that the first choice of important skills to their job is identified as conflict management. We see 15 people have made that their first choice. Listening, 10 people have made it their second choice. And the top second choice is listening. So you can see that you're zeroing in on the top 2. You also see that third coming up is local rules, and that can give you the good 3 areas that you might want to focus on, which were clearly identified in the needs assessment scenario, but gives you some level of necessity as to what sequence you might be offering them in, or at what level you might want to be focusing them on. When would you want to use a ranking question? When you wanted to learn how staff prioritize an event, an activity, or an experience. However, there are a couple of useful notes that you want to pay attention to, and that is the ranking questions must focus on a single criteria for ranking. In this particular example that we used, we focused on skills important to the job. You also have to recognize that staff must have the information or the knowledge to be able to rank the items, so that when you're ranking conflict management skills, you're ranking listening skills, you've got to make sure that you and staff have the same concept of what those skills may mean. Otherwise, the information or the priorities that you're getting may not be things that you can use, because there isn't this universality around the meaning of what those ranking items are. Okay, we have some time for questions. We've got about 15 minutes for questions, and let me repeat the fax number, or at least say the fax number that you have up there on your screen. It's 1-800-488-0397, and at this time, let me turn it over to Bob. Bob?
Thank you, Suzanne. We do have a number of questions here. The first question is from the San Diego, California Southern, Joanne Polcari. Joanne, are you on the line? Hi, Joanne. We can barely hear you.
Hi, Bob. Is that a little better?
How is that, Suzanne?
It's slightly better. Why don't we give it a try and see where we come out?
Bob?
Okay, that's better, Joanne. Go ahead. What is your question for Suzanne?
My question would be that in certain scales where we're talking about quantity, might it be effective to put an even number of possible responses to avoid the central tendency of maybe selecting a 3 if you have a scale ranging from a 1 to 5, perhaps?
That is an extremely good point. Many people will sometimes put in 7 and or 4 is a possibility as well, or 5, not 4, but 5 or 7. If you use odd number responses, there's very likely that people will tend towards the middle, and that's a very good point to make, Joanne. So, and in fact, I do it in my practice with surveys. I will have 6 to 8, so that will lead people to go one way or the other. They really have to make the decision. Thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, thank
You're
you.
welcome, and thank you for your response.
Thank you, Joanne. And in much the same vein, we had a question from Woody Parks, Bankruptcy Court in Minnesota. Woody, did that get to your question, or is there another question you would like to ask Suzanne?
No, that answered my question. Thanks to Joanne, I guess. I was at a seminar last week, and the speaker made a point similar to that. I noticed Friday I had a training event, and I got an awful lot of 3s, and it wasn't very useful to me.
Exactly.
So I think I will try that, to have just even numbers and force them to choose whether they liked it or not.
Yeah, exactly. There is a tendency to go to the middle, and that's what's alluded to when I talk about the Likert scale and that neutral value. So if you really can make it, if you don't have enough information to know that the majority of the people responding to your survey are going to connect up with some point on those choices that's going to give you some clear information, then making sure that you have an even number of response choices that forces them one way or the other, because you'd want to have 3 pros, so to speak, and 3 cons. If you have an even number of response choices, then that forces them to make that decision, and that information will help you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Woody. We also have a faxed-in question, Suzanne, from Mary Baker in Nevada. This is really a 2-part question. Mary would like to know, is it a good idea to mix open and closed questions in a survey? And is it a good idea to use different response scales in the same survey?
Thank you for that question. It's really hard to kind of get at all the issues. And the answer to the first one is yes, you can, but you need to be very judicious. Some experts identify that 2 open questions are really the maximum that you should include in a survey, because then you have the problems that I identified with open questions, and that is the effort staff need to fill them out, as well as you to interpret the information. If you're going to include open questions, you really want to look at it for 2 reasons. One, to do it early on to get some information from them that may be helpful in focusing them through the rest of your survey. And secondly, to help change the pace. Answering the same types of questions may kind of get tiresome. So what you can do to kind of spur their interest again might be to have them answer an open question. We all, at some point, hate to be put into boxes. We're all human beings. We all consider ourselves unique. So an open question can be very helpful in re-energizing people, especially if you've got a longer type of survey and you want to re-energize them, say, midway through. Do not put your open-ended questions at the very end. Because of the energy and effort they've already put into it. You've probably pretty much exhausted them as they completed the survey. Unless you feel that with the staff that you have, and this may be a judgment on your part, that you know they'll want to comment. I think including opportunities for them to comment at some place along the way in order to establish context can be really important. So I would highly recommend that as well.
Okay, thank you, Suzanne, and thank you for your question, Mary. At this point, let me just ask if there are any push-to-talk sites where someone might have a question that you haven't written down on a fax but might just like to ask off the top of your head, so to speak? No? Okay. All right. If you do, why, feel free to pop in. I've got a couple of questions here that came up in the initial survey we did in planning for this program. One of which deals with, a lot of people were interested in the question, Suzanne, of how many questions should be on a survey. How do I know when I've got enough questions in my survey?
That can vary with your needs assessment. It depends upon the amount of information that you're trying to get, but I think you want to keep your survey as short as possible. You really don't want to have people spending more than, let's say, 15-20 minutes because they just won't devote any more time to it. And I think you're looking at no more than 30-35 questions on a survey. And if you've developed them with enough research and focus on the information that you need, that should be able to give you the kind of information that you want to focus on some training solutions.
All right. Thank you, Suzanne. Another question that came up was, Randy, does everyone have to take the survey for the results to be valid?
No, they don't. One of the issues falls around sampling, and sampling is one of those arithmetic formulas that you can use when you are dealing more specifically with larger groups of people. And I'm not a mathematician, so I always have to check my own table of what is an appropriate number to sample when you have different numbers within your audience, so that you're getting enough people to respond to your survey to make it valid. But I think one of the things you do need to know is that since many of you have small units that you're surveying, that the smaller your unit is, the more likely you're going to have to survey more people. So that if you're dealing with 25 people in your court unit or 30 people, I would not choose a sample for your particular situation. I would make sure that everybody got that survey. When you get into larger numbers, then I think you're looking at limiting that survey and looking at the sampling process.
All right, good. Thanks, Suzanne. One question I have for you, if I might, is I noticed in your discussion you talk about asking people about their skills as they relate to tasks that are necessary to do in their job. Why not just ask people what kind of training they need? Wouldn't that be simpler and more direct?
I think the issue around that is that there are different, communication is probably the biggest issue here. For those of you who do training, you probably are aware of that what one person thinks is conflict management training and what another person thinks is conflict management training, and what you know to be conflict management training may be three different things. Also, too, there really isn't an understanding at what level, if staff identify that they would like to have conflict management, what level are they talking about? I mean, have they had previous training? Is this are we talking about more sophisticated issues that crop up? So how you're going to, or at what level you're going to deliver that training in order to improve performance is going to be an issue. So all of that crops up when you're asking people to identify what specific training they want or think that they need. That's the reason why whenever you're doing any kind of a survey on assessing performance, breaking skills down into component behaviors enables staff who are responding to a survey to say, yes, I can do that, no, I can't do that, yeah, sometimes I can do that, well, you know, I'd like to get more training in that particular area. And that gives you, the training coordinator, the opportunity to say, well, you know, 75% of the staff, or however many percentage of the staff, are having trouble in this one particular area. It allows you to target and focus specific training rather than offering generic conflict training that may or may not meet performance needs and may or may not help people to deal with the concrete problems and issues that are occurring on the job.
Okay, thanks, Suzanne. One last question, if I might. I noticed on page 28 in the participant guide you did include a sample survey for customer service training.
Yes.
Now, if someone in the courts were planning to do customer service training or looking at that as a possibility, could they simply use your survey?
The sample survey is designed to be just that, a sample. It's got the types of questions you could use, and it gives you the information, part of the information that you would want to use for a customer service assessment, but it certainly isn't enough. You would have to expand and add more questions in order to obtain the information that you need. But you could use it as a model so that the types of questions that you're asking are the types of questions that would be useful and helpful to you, but that you would need to focus on a wider body of information that is currently now in that sample.
Okay, very good. Very good. Thank you very much.
Okay. Now let's continue on. We've got another part of the program to look forward to, and I want to cover the cover letter. And this is what you're going to need to focus on in order to give people who are participating in your project information about exactly what you're doing and why they need to be involved in it. Questions that you're going to need to answer with your cover letter are, what is this about? Who wants to know this information? Why do they want this? Why was I picked? How important is this? Will this be difficult? How long will it take? Will I be identified? How will this be used? What's in it for me? And when should I do it? Let's take a look at the opening of a sample cover letter, which pertains again to our needs assessment scenario. And it reads, a recent study of customer comment cards indicated an increase in customer service complaints during the past year. Senior management has asked training to survey all court staff to determine what training will help you deal with customers more effectively. Now, when you look at the questions that we needed to answer in the cover letter, you'll see we answered the first 3. You then need to focus, to expand on the information, you'll need to focus on the remaining 8 questions, providing them with staff that information so that they understand why they're doing something and what it is that's going to happen to the material they provide you. Let's take a look at increasing return rates. And again, I know that that's one of the boons to using surveys. And once again, while everything we talk about here is about increasing return rates, these are some of the things you need to pay attention to. And closed questions will help you minimize the burden of response on the part of staff. Anything that can shorten the amount of time and burden to them with regards to responding to your survey is going to be helpful. Next, you want to build rapport with staff to increase interest and motivation. And thirdly, you want to support your effort with follow-up phone calls, emails, or memos. This may mean prior to the survey, you need to follow up with people by phone or sending out a memo during the process, and at some point when your deadlines are being reached, you need to follow up to make sure that you're getting all the information back that will help make your survey valid. There's one point I want to add in here also too, and that is the committee process to design and develop your surveys. This can be very helpful to help you get buy-in to your project, as well as to communicate the purpose and scope of what it is that you're trying to do to a broader range of people that might necessarily happen if you're working on this alone. I'd like to now turn to the physical layout of the survey. And the physical layout is what helps the survey be attractive, convenient to use, and easy to identify. In terms of size, it needs to be letter size, and it needs to allow for generous space between the questions. Now, while one of the ideas is that surveys need to be short, you also don't want to put a whole series of questions on one page, jammed together, so that you've kept your survey very short. It's really important that you allow enough space for questions because it invites people into the process of writing their responses on the survey and doesn't force them to think, oh Lord, how am I going to be able to get through this? So the white space that you include on your paper is going to be extremely important to inviting people into the process. Then, in terms of paper, you want to take a look at the quality of the paper stock. This has to do with how much handling the survey is going to have. If a lot of people will be handling your survey, especially in the administration or the processing of it, you're going to want to use a heavier stock. Color. There are no specific colors that are predominant one over the other, but you want to make sure that the colors don't bother the person who's reading or inhibit them from reading it. You may want to use color just to help identify the survey among a host of other papers that they may have on their desk or in their box, or just to delight people, because anything that can make it attractive and more fun to complete is going to be something that will be helpful for you. Then you want to take a look at the numbering of your questions. All of the questions need to be numbered consecutively with no omission. This prevents confusion on the part of the person responding to the survey, as well as you when you're beginning to compile your returns. And finally, take a look at your typeface and graphics, or if you don't have any, including them can be very helpful. Symbols can be used to help guide staff through the survey, especially if it's getting to be a longer survey. You can use graphics to help guide people through that. Also, clip art can be fun. It can help bring a sense of humor or delight to people as they're filling out the survey. So that's another thing that you can consider to help entertain people in order to invite them through the survey and help them complete it. They appreciate that extra attention. Now, before leaving the topic of design, I'd like to turn to the issue of pre-testing. Pre-testing is a really key piece that I think you need to focus on because it is important to evaluate the clarity of your questions, the adequacy of your instructions, and the quality of the data that you're going to be getting back from your survey. Specific questions that you're going to want to get answered when you do your pre-test is whether staff understand what the survey is about. Also, are your instructions clear? Which parts, if any, are confusing? And does staff feel comfortable answering the question? You also want to find out if the wording of each item is clear. And you want to see if all staff infer the same meaning. Then you want to see whether the answers obtained are adequate. Is there sufficient detail that you're going to be getting back to work with your findings? Are the transitions that you've included in your survey smooth? Which items are most difficult to answer? Is the survey too long? And finally, is the survey convenient to administer? The pretest will be the proving ground for all of the items we considered here this morning: open versus closed questions, the types of response scales that you choose, as well as the physical layout. When you're setting up your pretest, there are a couple of guidelines that you want to follow. First is that you want to choose a representative sample, making it a small representative sample. 25% might be a good guideline here, but make sure that your minimum is 5, no matter how small your court unit is, and your maximum is 30. Again, it needs to be representative. When you are conducting your pretest, one of the things you need to pay attention to is that if 20 to 40% of your sample are requiring clarification in any particular area of your survey project, then you need to pay attention to it. But those of you who recognize that if you take 25% of 5 people, you have 1 person, that means that you're going to begin to need to bring your judgment to bear as to whether, is this a problem with the survey? Is this something I can help by changing some element of my survey? Or is it this particular person who's having the problem? There's an idiosyncrasy here, so no amount of clarification or change is going to be able to help the problem. So your judgment's going to have to come to bear on that particular issue when you're dealing with small groups of people. Now let's turn to reviewing your findings and crafting your training recommendations. All your survey data is coming back, you're sorting it out, you're compiling it. What are some of the ways that you're going to be able to summarize this data and be able to interpret it and use it for the final report that you're going to develop? We've talked about percentage and number distributions earlier with the response scales. Now I'd like you to take a look at a chart that identifies a number distribution, and it is in response to a section 1 of your sample survey, question number 2. And what this identifies here is the number of staff as they're broken out by function for each of the 3 court units we've identified. So you get a clear sense of the number distribution. If you turn to the next visual, and there is a copy of this in your guide, you'll see the percentages, how they break out for the particular functions in the different court units. If you look in your guide and you see the number and the percentages compared, you'll see that while it's the same data, it graphically looks different, so that whether you choose a number distribution or a percentage distribution to visually summarize your data may depend upon the size of the audience that you're working with and what will truthfully support the recommendations that you're trying to put in place to management. Then if you look at our next slide, we take question number 5, and we're doing the same thing here, a percentage distribution. Here we're looking at half day, third day, quarter day, sixth day, or never in terms of how much of somebody's day, this is a quantity scale, how much of somebody's day is spent interacting with external customers. The next slide takes that same information and puts it on a number distribution. So again, you can see the variation and the difference between the number and the percentage. Then what I'd like to focus on, now that you've seen some graphic visuals of how summary reportings would be shown, let's take a look at what some of the most typical summary measures are, and there are 3 of them. The first one is the mean or the average, and the concept behind that is that you divide the sum of the value by the number of values in order to get your mean. I'll give you an example in just a minute, but that basically is the concept to it. It focuses on distribution of the number of responses across a continuum. The other most typical summary measure is the median. It identifies the middle value. It can be used on the same data that a mean would be used, but there is a distinct difference because the median is not as sensitive to extremes on a continuum as the mean would be. So since a median only identifies the middle value, it really can focus on the center portion of a continuum when there is a range of distribution in responses. And finally, let's look at the mode, which is the most frequently recorded answer or the most common response. Let's take a look at using a mean average, and one of the most common places you would use it is when you are computing or summarizing Likert scale responses. Here we've taken our example of the statement and summarized the information and using the mean as a way of summarizing the data. I need to identify sections here for you in order to understand how I came to get the mean, and I hope mathematically it's going to be clear. But the numbers that I assigned, which also help you to identify the response choices, also are values that I've given to the range of these responses. And I've given the lowest value of 1 to strongly disagree, which is the high negative, and I've given the highest value to strongly agree, which I'm giving a strong positive to. And the disagree, mildly agree are then 2, 3, 4, and 5. The number that's next to those values that are in the circle is the number of staff who've responded to each of those choices. Now, to get to the value at the right, what I've done is taken the number of staff, such as in strongly disagree, which is 5, multiplied it times the value of 1, and I get 5 as the total value for strongly disagree. In strongly agree, I've taken the value of 5, multiplied it times the number of staff, which are 4, and come up with the value of 20. The total of all the values for the responses come to 83. With the number of people who've responded to this question being as 32 and dividing that into 83, I've come up with a mean of 2.8. What this summary tells me is that my staff or your staff are really falling between disagree and mildly agree that their court unit makes customer satisfaction its top priority. Because they don't even get to mildly agree, they're still in the realm of disagreeing, though it's a stronger positive than it would be, say, a 2. This is telling you that customer satisfaction is not really recognized as a top priority within the court unit, which is something you're going to want to know as you're identifying your training recommendations. Let's now turn to the example of the median in the quantity scale, and you'll see that this is a more simpler way of summarizing the data. What we've done for this example is literally just split it in half so that I've identified a value between 3 and 4 as the 50% point. And my 50% point has been the number of staff who've responded to this, so that from about half to almost none is where 16 of the staff fall, which is 50% of the staff have half to less than half of their activities receiving clear instruction in terms of customer-related activities. And those that have most to almost all their activities is 50%. All this tells me is that my median is somewhere between 3 and 4, and you would want to get into a more mathematical formula to find out where exactly that would fall. Let's now turn to the mode as an example, and I've chosen the ranking question as the way to identify that. All the mode does is tell you what is the most commonly reported response, what is the most typical response that your staff are giving you. And in this regard, 11 people have chosen local rules as the skill being most important to their job. So the mode is giving you the most frequently, most commonly reported response, and that's basically all that it tells you. It should be used sparingly because it is probably the most imprecise method of summary. Okay, let's turn to our final component of our discussion here, and that is where you've tried to get to through doing all of this, and that is the preparation of the final report. The focus of your final report is going to be your opportunity to identify your recommendations and support your findings in order to lend credibility and soundness to your recommendations as to how to solve this problem. Our final report consists of 2 elements. The first is the executive summary, and you have a sample of that in your guide on page 22. Your summary is a prelude to the body of the survey report. It covers major highlights, and it uses bullets and brief paragraphs. You want to keep it to no more than 2 pages. Following your executive summary should be the text of your report, and this includes a narrative of the survey, the methodology, who you surveyed, everything that you did with regard to the project, and the results that you've come up with. You also want to include as many visuals as you can that summarize the data, because that really gives across a lot of information using charts and graphs like the percentages and the distribution charts that I was showing you. It can give a lot of information to the people who are going to be reading your report and supporting your recommendations. Then I'd like us to take a look finally at where, again, we were trying to get to when I identified the classifications of needed training. And these are the final tables that bring us to the end of this assessment. Your purpose was to define what training you wanted to implement. The classification of training need can be communicated through these types of tables, and there are going to be 3 because of the 3 areas that we were focusing on for the needs assessment scenario. This one is conflict management, and again we're focusing on the gap that I had identified earlier when we looked at this right after the introduction of the needs assessment scenario. There's a high relevance of conflict management to staff in the pursuance of their job. 72% rank conflict management is extremely important or extremely relevant, while only 12% consider themselves highly competent in that area. This tells you that you need to implement conflict management training. How to implement that, at what level, the kinds of behaviors you need to be focusing on, that's hopefully what you'll be getting from the other data that you've gotten from your survey. When we look at our next area, which is knowledge of court unit operations, you'll see that the percentage of staff rating it high in relevancy are 78%. However, 81% consider themselves competent in that area. So hopefully, knowing that they've understood what you've meant when you've identified court unit operations, there's really not going to be any need for you to focus attention in this area to implement any kind of training. So it gives you this kind of support, saying that we really don't need to spend time and energy focusing on court unit operations. And then in our next visual, you'll see the need for training in listening skills. And here we've identified, again, a high relevancy that staff see of listening skills to their job. And there's kind of a midpoint sense of competence, which means that while you're not talking as high a level of perceived lack of competence as in conflict management, a 52%, 48% split is still high enough for you to pay attention to, because when you did look at the number of staff who are interacting by phone and in person, where most of the complaints were, a 50% problem with competency or a 48% problem with competency can really be one of the major issues behind the increase in customer complaints. That brings us to the end of my presentation. I know that we still have some time for questions, and we're going to take about a minute break here, but let me identify the fax number for those of you who are faxing your questions in, and it's 1-800-488-0397, and we'll be joining you in another minute.
Well, thank you for those comments, Suzanne. They were very helpful. And
thank you.
Thank you for joining me at the table here. And we might have a chance to discuss a couple of questions before the end of the broadcast entirely.
Great.
One question I had when you were talking about the mean, the median, and the mode was, I am not much of a math student. My wife gives me grief when I try and do our checkbook oftentimes. I was wondering, when would I use the mean, the median, or the mode in surveys?
Okay, the mean is a summary measure that you would use when your responses are a continuum, and I think the Likert scale is really the best example of that. So that because it's a continuum, that means people can fall somewhere in between the individual choices, like disagreement and agreement. So you can have a range of somewhere between strongly disagree and disagree. So if we identified a mean as like 2.5 or 3.5, then that mathematical term has value for you. So a mean would be very useful for you there. A median would not be useful on for a Likert scale, because your median is the point at which 50%, the value at which 50% are above and 50% are below. So you would use the median whenever your questions, whenever your response choices are mutually exclusive, or whenever you're dealing with people and there are numbers of people and you really can't split those people up into like, you know, if you say 2.8 and you're dealing with numbers of people, that doesn't have any meaning because you either have 3 people or you have 4 people, but you can't have 2.5 people, which is where a mean would come up. So that's where a median would really be helpful. So the quantity scale is really good for using the median. Another, in terms of the mode, when you would want to use the mode, that's really a very simple way of summarizing the data, and all it identifies is just the most common response. So if you don't need to have the precision that you would get from using the mean or even using the median, then a mode might be helpful to you, because it'll say people responded as this is the most often reason why I did this, or this is the most common response that I can give you, this is the most common occurrence that's going on, and that's all it says, is it's the most common response. Does that help?
That's helpful.
Okay,
yes,
good.
all right, thank you very much. I think I have a little more confidence now in when to use each of those summary measures. I was also wondering, I can imagine there would be times when people might feel that there really is not time to pre-test surveys, to pretty them up. If that's the case, would people be better off using some other method for doing a needs assessment, such as interviews, perhaps?
There are two issues I'd like to broach in your question. And one is you've got to make time for a pretest. You really do, because it gets the bugs out of the whole project. If you put together a survey for your needs assessment and you don't pretest it and you send it out and you get information back, or you don't get enough responses back to make it valid, or you've missed the mark in terms of people are confused about what you're asking of them, or the questions just aren't giving you the information that you need, then you've put all this time into the project, and it's been a waste. So if you look at pretest as not having enough time for it, then you really do have to reconsider that. That's really not a good reason. It helps find the bugs there. Right. But interviews that you brought up are more time consuming than the survey is. And I think you may be thinking of the development time of questions. That can be a little bit more time consuming. And I think when you look at initially designing survey questions, what you have is an initial investment of time. Well, once you build a standard bank of questions, I think you can start to cut down on that, which makes surveys probably much easier to use. But interviews and focus groups are more costly and also require more time to implement, so you wouldn't be saving anything.
Interesting point. All right. So once you've got a series of questions developed, you could tweak them a little bit.
Yes, and apply them to individual needs assessments. And yeah, I highly recommend that.
Interesting. Okay. How long do you generally recommend people give respondents to return surveys?
I generally use 2 weeks as a guideline, possibly stretching to 3 weeks. But 2 weeks is a good guideline because, number one, you want to give them enough time to be able to have the survey completed, so that they amidst all the things that they have to do, we're always so short on time, that they will take the time to complete it. So give them enough time to do that. But you don't want to give them too much time that they'll forget about it, that they'll set it aside and say, oh, I'll get to that next week, and then all of a sudden it disappears among other things. And the 2 weeks gives you an opportunity to be able to do some follow-up, saying, hey, yeah, I sent you that survey, could you get it into me in the next few days? And that way you're giving them a heads-up notice. But one thing I'd like to advise is that always give a deadline date for it to be returned, and always make sure that that's not the right date for you. Give yourself a few extra days so that people who do not, number one, get things on time, still have that window to get it to you, but make sure they don't know that, because otherwise then they'll say, well, I don't need to get it by this deadline, so therefore they will, so you'll get it back and then be able to get some of those people who get it to you late, and you can still get their surveys into the findings.
Terrific. All right, very good advice. All right, very good. I will try and remember that. One last question, if I might, and that is, what about giving respondents a summary of the survey findings?
Oh, yes, that's extremely important, and I'm going to talk to all of you about that, not just to Bob, because I know Bob had the question. But one of the most important things you really have to remember is that participants in any project that you're working on who are giving you the information really need to know what happens to that information. It's going to do a couple of things. It's going to have them be more honest in their responses. They'll understand the whole project. They know why they're being asked, that you're more likely to get higher return rates. But also, they want to know what's happened to the information. So if you provide them with the summary results of it or the summary findings, they will then be more committed to any future project that you might be involved in, and you'll get buy-in that way. But also, it's a way of saying thank you for your time, for your effort. I'd like to tell you this is what we've done with it. Also, if you're going to be implementing any kind of decisions as a result of your recommendations, for them to know what is the rationale behind the decisions, what went into the process, getting the results of the survey findings are going to enable that decision for them to be able to support the decision that's made. Okay.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you very much, Suzanne.
Thank you, Bob.
And again, thank you very much for your comments and your discussion and all the good work that went into the preparation of this broadcast. I think it's been very helpful and will enhance the use of surveys considerably in the courts.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And thank all of you.
All right. And if you have any questions that we did not get to during the broadcast, please write them out on the form, I think, that came in your mailing. Have a question about using surveys, or you can write them on a blank piece of paper or anything. Fax them in to me if you would, please, and Suzanne and I will be sure that you get an answer to that question. Lastly, if I could ask you please to give your evaluations and complete the site roster and give that to your facilitator so that they can be mailed in to Yvonne Brown here at the center. And I think our center address, if you don't have that, is now up on the screen. As you know, the rosters will tell us how many people viewed the program, and Congress looks for this kind of information each year when they're deciding the center's budget. The more, the better. And the evaluations, of course, tell us what you thought of the program. And as always, we look forward to your evaluations and your assessments for guidance on our programming. So it would really be quite helpful to future center broadcasts and programs to receive that information. That's it for now here. Thank you very much for your time and participation. And we look forward to seeing you here again on FJTN. Take care.